So welcome. We are here today. I am going to immediately pass things over to Dr. Gio Laws because this is one of our sessions as part of our 2022 National Distance Learning Week. So thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Gio.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you today and to have this conversation. So last year, when we celebrated the 15th anniversary of National Distance Learning Week, we were focusing on leadership. We were celebrating all aspects of leadership in distance learning. And one of the important topics to consider in distance learning is how we serve our rural populations. So for that, we have a very special guest today, someone who's very dear to me because we are a product of the same doctoral program in higher education leadership. Dr. Matt Newlin. So Matt is going to talk to us about leadership perspectives of rural distance learning. Matt, welcome, and the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you so much, Gio. I appreciate that introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen, and I'm so excited to be here. Yes, Gio and I completed the same program in the same cohort, but for her, I would not have gotten through the program. So I'm very, very thankful for her being a part of my program. And also our program, and this will come up in the conversation today, our program was 100% online. So Gio and I come to this both as practitioners, but as students who have gone through this work, as I'm sure many of you have as well. So we're going to dive right in. Like Gio said, my name is Matt Newlin. I am the founder and principal of Matt Newlin Consulting, but I've worked in higher education at institutions and nonprofits for about 16 years. I've worked at public and private 4 years. I've worked at proprietary schools. I've worked at college access organizations, working nationally. And then I've also done as a consultant, I've worked with clients like Harvard's Graduate School, Arizona State University, the state of Missouri, higher education and workforce development. So I come to this with a lot of different perspectives because I've been very fortunate in my career that I've been able to see higher ed from a lot of different angles. I always kind of pitch myself as a consultant that I have 3 buckets of expertise, kind of 4. I focus on first generation students. I focus on low income, limited income students. Rural students is a big passion area of mine, obviously. And then also financial literacy, financial aid education is a big passion area of mine. And a lot of this, as you can see on this screen, comes from my background. I am a proud working class student, Pell Grant eligible as an undergraduate, coming from a first generation situation where I was first in my extended family to complete college. So a lot of the things that we're seeing today are things that I ran into as well as a student. So hopefully we can continue making progress going forward. My work with rural students is not just as a consultant. I also am the creator and host of the Rural College Student Experience podcast. Shameless plug. I would encourage you all to look it up wherever you find your podcasts. But that it will also inform some of our conversation today, where I've had a chance to interview almost 24 students. I was going to say face-to-face, one-on-one, to learn about their experiences as undergraduates and graduates around being a rural student. And a lot of the conversations have come around access to broadband and being online and completing online degrees. So that's going to inform some of our conversation today. The last thing I'll say before we dive in, by the nature of this format, this is going to be very slide heavy, a lot of information coming from me, but I do not want this to be a lecture. So please, I want to make this as informal as possible. Please raise your hand, unmute yourself, put comments, questions in the chat. You do not have to hold them till the end. Please feel free to interrupt at any point, especially if there's something you want to dive a little deeper in, get a little bit more details about. But please, let's make this as interactive as possible because I don't want it to be just me talking for the next 45 minutes or so. So let's dive in. Why are we talking about rural students and distance learning? One of the reasons is because we're just starting to talk about rural students more broadly in higher education. I tell a lot of people that I work with that it's only been since the 2016 election that colleges and universities have taken a serious look at rural students. So for those of you who are in this space, who are doing this work, it might be new to you to be thinking about rural or remote students or tribal populations, which have their own inherent challenges. But we're talking about this because because of COVID, because this moved to online learning, there are populations that are just getting left out, and rural students are one of those. And so that's why we're here today. I want to start, though, to learn more about who's in this room. I was going to do a quick poll. I wasn't able to get it together. But really quick, let's just take a minute in the chat. I would love if you could tell me, just share what type of institution you're from. You don't have to say the name. 2-year, 4-year, public, private. I would love to hear what types of institutions, maybe even the state that you're from, because that could be really interesting. But go ahead and drop that in the chat now, the type of institution you're at. And then also the second piece I'll ask is, as far as you know, what percentage of your student population is rural? If you may or may not know, you may have no idea, but ballpark, are you serving a large number of rural students? Are you a metropolitan university? And it's probably very few. Just best guess, what percentage would you say you're serving? Thank you, Gio, for putting that in the chat. I should have had that prepared. I appreciate it. Okay, so private 4-year in Illinois. That's fantastic. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, so I am not too far from you. We've got privates, University of Arkansas, 4-year open enrollment. 100% of the population rural. So Carol Strong, I am going to be relying on you to share a lot of your experience from perspectives, because clearly you know this work. Private, community college, West Virginia, 80% rural. That makes absolute sense, Laura. Oh, and someone working with the library programs. That's fantastic. That's great. Working with rural libraries is another really important area. So definitely, Nan, would love to hear more from you as we go through this conversation. Public 4-year, 100% rural. Great. Thank you, Jody. 2-year community college, dual enrollment to rural areas. We don't have time to get into dual enrollment here today, but I would love to follow up, have a conversation about how important that is. 2-year public. Great. So we've got worked with remote. Yeah, this is fantastic. We've got people from a lot of different perspectives and sitting in a lot of different areas. So this is great. So again, as I said, I don't want this to be just me. So please chime in, throw in your comments, raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and say, hey, Matt, I have something to say, because we clearly have some experts in the room, and this is great. So why are we here? First and foremost, when Gio asked me to get involved in this work, and originally in the distance learning week in the fall, I was really excited to see that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a key part of USDLA. I think that's really fantastic. So specifically, I was really impressed by goals 9 and 10. So promote equity and access to lifelong learning, and to promote diversity. That is wonderful. That is on point. In every organization working with higher education, that's where you should be. And that's exactly why we're talking about rural students, because rural students are severely underrepresented in higher education. So this chart here from NCES will show you that only about 29% of college enrollees nationally are rural. Now, that's only slightly underrepresented. Nationally, about 33 to 35% of people live in rural places. So we can't say it's completely underrepresented on college campuses. What I would say, though, they are significantly not seen on college campuses because there are so few of them. And because it's one of the invisible identities, like being working class, like being first generation, a lot of times rural students can't find communities and find people who come from similar backgrounds. So because of that, they run into inherent challenges because they're so in the minority. They don't see or connect with a lot of people who come from similar backgrounds. So I always like to start off with this graph because I think it very clearly shows the discrepancy in enrollment for rural versus non-rural learners. This is a really helpful graph. If you've never seen this before, this shows it's sort of a heat map of across the country, which counties have the lowest post-secondary enrollment, attainment levels. So you can see here, the light yellowish is 0 to 10%, and that dark blue is over 50%. So not surprisingly, New England and the Northeast, a lot of dark blue, a lot of blue, very educated there. Similar thing in the Northwest, up and around Chicago. But you get out to what we know are just rural areas, especially near the South, and you start getting to see those lighter colors, that fewer, less likely to enroll in post-secondary education. And that has an impact on the cascading effects, because if we don't have a good, strong, built-in network of people with bachelor's or with associate's degrees, let alone postgraduate degrees, we're going to have a limited number of role models, of trailblazers who can show other rural students the way. And so I want people to keep this map in mind, because we just have areas of our country where it's very, very unlikely to run into someone who's gone to college. And that's just because of a lot of the things we're going to talk about here today. But keep that in mind and how that really changes things at thinking from the student perspective. All right, and I apologize. I'm also trying to keep an eye on the comments that come in as we go through, so I apologize. Right out the start, a lot of times we have this really unfortunate myth in our country that rural is a monolith, that every rural community is the same. Every small town, every farming community is the same, and nothing could be further than the truth. The people like me who do this rural work, we're constantly saying rural is not a monolith. There is a diverse number of cultures, races, people, experiences, communities, employers. I mean, rural is so diverse, and you go to Virginia versus Texas versus Oregon, and you just see how beautifully different all of these areas are. And a part of the problem is that we haven't recognized that as a people who are working in higher education, and so we sometimes forget the diversity. But this slide shows our rural counterparts, our rural students compared to their non-rural counterparts are less likely to enroll in college beyond high school. If they do, it's much more likely to be a 2-year, a certificate, a 1-year degree, something like that, which is excellent. And we want to encourage those types of degrees and those types of programs. But unlike suburban and urban peers, they don't have the opportunities to find the right match and fit. So a lot of times rural students are going to the nearest college or wherever everyone else goes, or whatever offers a program they're interested, rather than finding the exact right match and fit. And this is a challenge for all rural populations, but especially for students of color. And so you can see Black students, American Indian, Alaska Natives, significantly less likely to have an associate's degree or any 4-year degree beyond high school. And that's a problem, right? Because now we're just reproducing the same people who are going to college again and again and again, and we're not getting that diverse perspective. And this is not new. You can see the rural versus urban areas on the right side of the screen as well. This has been going on for some time, and that just shows again and again that rural students don't seek that opportunity, don't have the pathway to that opportunity like our non-rural peers. And we're going to talk about this data and how it impacts our work as we go through. As I said, this is not new. This chart from Wall Street Journal kind of says it all, right? You can see the U.S. college education rates for rural, or for the U.S. average in orange, urban, suburban, and that light blue has just been going up and up and up, and rural hasn't stayed flat, but it has gone nowhere near as high as the average or urban and suburban. So what that means is down here at the bottom, you've just got the rural population. Again, it's not stagnating, but the college enrollment is not going up the way it should be. And a lot of that comes from the messaging, the types of programs that are offered, the access to college that we sometimes overlook. And I'm going to talk about all of these, the breakdowns of opportunity as we go through. Real quick, I want to stop and ask if there's any questions, comments, thought so far. I know I'm throwing a lot of data at you, but it's important to have this foundation.
So far, we seem to be good on the chat.
Okay. All right, fantastic. All right, let's keep going. So that's why we're here. That's the current situation. But how did we get here? And again, this background information is, to me, very, very important to understand the context, the current environment that we're in. So this is not a new phenomenon, as I just said. The population growth in rural areas for the last 100 years has pretty much stagnated. So we just saw how enrollment has gone up, but pretty sluggish. Rural population has stagnated for almost 100 years. And that's really unfortunate because we can see the urban population continues to grow. What this means is that the people who are staying in rural communities, in rural towns, small communities, they're being left behind in terms of the opportunities, the resources, the access to different abilities, whether it's things for vacation, whether it's employment, whether it's for healthcare. The rural population are being left behind because we've moved to a metropolitan, very urban-centric model. What this means for us as higher education employees is that more likely our environments, our coworkers, our peers, our directors, our presidents have probably grown up in urban and suburban environments. And so we are that much more distant from our rural peers. We don't know what rural students, what rural people need, because our structures are really based on an urban-centric model. So that's something to keep in mind. Additionally, this is a huge area, kind of a pet peeve for people who are in the rural space, is this definition of rural. One of the things I'm going to encourage you all to do, and we'll talk about this later, is defining rural for you and your institution or organization. And I say that because we actually don't even have a good definition of what rural means in this country. The census defines it one way. The Office of Management Budget defines another way. USDA defines it a third way. States have their own. Research companies have their own. Everyone defines rural differently. And what is really frustrating, as you can see here, is the census doesn't even define rural. Everything is defined as what it's not. So it's not an urban area. That must mean it's an urban cluster, or it's a non-metro area. So we have these definitions that aren't even identifying the populations we need. And the same thing happens from Office of Management of Budget. It's not even rural, it's metropolitan, micropolitan, or neither. Okay. And so what that means is we're not even putting a label on it, which makes it for us harder to serve and identify those students. And if you think this isn't a practical matter, here's an example. On the left, you see the census definition of rural, those tiny little white spots, those tiny little pockets you see there. But then on the right, you see the OMB definition of rural versus non-rural, and you see large blocks and tracts of rural spaces across the country. So if you're working at an institution and you're using one definition versus another, you're going to get very different population sizes and locations. Again, this is the piece, especially for researchers who are doing this work. It's very hard to define rural because it kind of is amorphous a little bit, and it is ever changing. I tell people, you know rural when you see it, or you are rural when you feel it. And so a lot of times it's not necessarily about the population size or the density or the proximity to an urban space. It's really about the number of people, the access to amenities, access to resources, healthcare, things like that. And so it's a little bit harder it's more abstract, but it is important to find a definition that works for you and for your campus. And again, we'll talk about this as we go through. Yeah, Gio, was there a question?
Yes, we have some traffic on chat. Nan is wondering if suburbs are classified as rural.
Suburbs are typically, it's usually urban, suburban, and rural. Where it gets really tricky, and here in St. Louis, we have such urban sprawl that the urban versus rural line is really blurry. But often it's urban, suburban, and rural. And so I often talk about rural and non-rural. I just lump them together because the experiences are so different. But most of the time they're broken out by all three. Does that answer the question, you think?
Yeah, and Laura's saying that her area, looking at this map, seems to be both rural and non-rural.
Yeah, it's confusing and frustrating, right? That's the point of bringing it up. This is what we run into, and especially when you're trying to apply for grants, or I have friends who are doing research, and it's really frustrating to bang your head against the wall trying to identify similar data tracks, and they just don't exist. And so that's why I go back to, we all need to create our own definition, and I'll talk about that at the end of how you might do that. All right, so let's keep moving. So again, this is how we got here. These are all of the breakdowns and gaps in our structures that have led to our rural students needing this additional support. Now, I'm sure everyone here has heard of education deserts, but in case you haven't, education deserts are the idea of any locale, any location, a lot of times by zip code, is considered an education desert if there's not a 2-year or open access 4-year, an open access 4-year or only a community college within 60 miles of the location. All right. So if you're looking here, you can see across the country wide numbers of education deserts of over or under 50,000 people. And again, where do they seem to cluster? A lot of times it's in the Midwest, in the North, down through the South, not really on the coast, but we've got a lot of education deserts throughout our country where students don't have access to a campus environment within an hour to an hour and a half drive. Now, we're talking about distance learning and online learning, but one of the points I want to make in a few minutes is that proximity to home, even for online classes, is incredibly important for rural students. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But thinking about where you're located, the students you're serving and their needs, think about it in terms of these education deserts, because how far away are you from the students you're trying to serve? That sometimes does make a difference. And again, the overlap with rural places as well. Education deserts, just like rural overall, very diverse in terms of the number of people that that are affected by this. But the largest populations are for American Indian, Alaskan Natives, for Latino, Latinx, Black, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander without a physical location nearby. So once again, rural spaces are not just serving white students. Rural spaces are supporting and serving an incredibly diverse population of people. And so it's important to remember that they are being left out, not because of anything that we as institutions are intentionally doing, anything that they've done as individuals, but because of the structures that are in place that we have to work within and around. Really quick, I just want to show this because I found it interesting that there are still so many households, non-metropolitan rural households without a computer. As of 2018, you can see where they fall here. And then non-metropolitan rural households without high-speed home internet, especially down here in the South along Arizona, Texas, Arkansas, 45 to 55% without home internet. Think about those students who are trying to do online classes, let alone an online degree. It's practically impossible. So again, this is not something that's just left to the Midwest states or up north. This really is a problem across the country. So that's why I start out by asking kind of where you are, where you're situated, because this is something that affects every institution. And then finally, the last visual I wanted to show you was this map that shows service providers across the country. Now, where I am in St. Louis, we have plenty of internet service provider opportunities, as well as kind of the off-the-shelf things you can buy. So we're in that orange space that all providers are available. But you can see where in that green down at the bottom, there might only be one or two internet providers, broadband providers across the country. What does that mean? Well, if they're not running broadband down your street or in your area, you're not getting it. Or maybe they're laying it, but they're charging exorbitant rates because there's no competition. You also might not get it. If you're living in a relatively large area, metropolitan or otherwise, you probably don't think about these broadband issues or the limited options for your broadband. But for rural and small town populations, this is incredibly important because this is their experience every day of, I can't get online, or I can't get online with fast enough speed, or I don't even have access to internet because we're still using dial-up because that's the only service provider. These are all of the pieces that we need to keep in our minds as we're thinking about our rural students. Okay, so let's talk about challenges and needs. This is something that, again, is going to be based on what's out there in the research and the literature, but it's also going to be based on my own personal experiences working with rural students. My podcast, the clients I've worked with serving in rural populations is really what all of this is going to be based on. However, I really want to hear from all of you as well, because you're serving rural students, you're supporting them. You might even be a rural student yourself. So I would love to hear input from all of you as well. So what are the challenges beyond what I've already talked about? Challenges, needs. Rural students, first and foremost, most likely to enroll in programs or degrees that are geographically closest to their homes. And this is a point of research that comes up again and again and again in the literature. So even if they're doing an online degree program, they're most likely to enroll in that program at a college or university that is geographically close to their home. Most rural students attend college within 2 hours of their home, often much closer. And that leads to the disparity in outcomes, right? Because it's not saying that going to college X is bad or you're not going to get a good education, but is it the right match, the right fit, the degree you need, the financial aid offer that you need? Rural students are much more limited in those options, so a lot of times they're disadvantaged. But again, even for online programs, they're most likely to go to the college down the street nearby, the name recognition, rather than an Arizona State University or Southern New Hampshire University, the national, things you hear there. They're more likely to go to the ones they trust and is in their community. So that's something to think about, and we're going to talk about that in a minute again too. I mentioned this earlier, because the post-secondary attainment rates are lower in rural areas because of all of the historic challenges we've talked about. There are fewer mentors, trailblazers, whatever you want to call them, to really clear the path for students with college aspirations. And this is true for traditional students going straight to college after high school, but also for non-traditional students who are, stopping their career, going back to college, getting a certificate, but particularly around online learning, because that's still so new, that in a lot of rural communities, and I've done training with college advisors sitting in rural high schools, there aren't those people who can say, yep, this is what it's like to go through college in Minnesota. This is what it's like to go through college, in a large city like Chicago or New York. But they also don't have people who can say, okay, with online learning, you've got to set a schedule, and you got to know that you're posting these discussions and that it's going to be asynchronous, meaning you're not going to be meeting class weeks at the same time each week in class. We don't have those mentors who can guide them through and say, this is what's going to be different than high school, or this is what's going to be different doing an online degree versus working like you've been for the last 10 or 11 years. There just aren't those people who can guide students through. And so that's one of the main reasons we're seeing a lack of post-secondary enrollment for rural students, is there aren't those rock stars who sort of lead the way. Whereas for many of us, we grow up and we have an uncle, an aunt, a grandparent, a neighbor, someone we could go to. It's just less likely in rural places. Online courses can be difficult for rural students due to lack of broadband access. This isn't anything new for all of you. We all lived through COVID. We all heard those heartbreaking stories of students who were trying to do homework on their phones or sitting in the McDonald's parking lot trying to use the internet. We all remember those stories, but that COVID, it was not new because of COVID. Those existed before COVID for rural and small town students, and they're continuing to be an issue now. It's not just the broadband access, like we were talking about, whether they have access to it or they have multiple providers or it's reliable. It's also just the type of barrier that we may have no control over. I have friends, colleagues who work in Appalachia, and you go down there, and because of the mountains and a lot of communities are down in the hollers, they can't run broadband, or if they do, it's very expensive. So because of the geographic barriers, they just can't get broadband there. Or our students in Alaska that are so far and remote that no one is going to pay to run line there. So sometimes we have control over these barriers, sometimes we don't, but we need to be aware of all of them in our work. These can be financial, access to broadband, legal, or just practical. If no one is allowed to lay line because of a national park that surrounds a community, nothing you can do. If there's a legal, monopoly that doesn't allow competition, you have nothing to do. And so we can't do anything for those situations except better support, better retain our students. Rural students, it's incredibly important for them to have a sense of community. And this is really critical for on-ground, seat-based students. But personally, as someone who's been through online degree programs myself, even as a non-rural student, that community is really, really important. And it's very hard to develop that virtually, especially if you're doing asynchronous courses. Now, this point is really critical for faculty and for instructional designers to be thinking about, how do you make a community in an online class or in an online degree program, recognizing that rural students are most successful when they feel they have a sense of belonging. Many rural communities, and this is painting with a broad brush, they're close-knit. They take care of one another. They look out for one another. It's a very interdependent style of existing, whereas college is independent. You're on your own. This is your grade. This is your class to fail. That's it. Rural students work and respond much better to community, to working in groups. So if you can introduce that and find ways to create community amongst your students, you're going to see, hopefully, your persistence and your retention rates continue to increase. So to throw some of the data and numbers at you as well, 30% of rural students have reported they don't have home broadband connection. So over a third, compared to urban and suburban, which is significantly lower. So again, disparities in opportunities is just that lack of broadband access. NCES confirmed something that a lot of us already know, that many rural students don't attend college because of financial concerns. And that's not just tuition and fees. One of the unfortunate things about this gap between rural learners and online learning is that online learning doesn't require cost of living. You can stay at home, you can live in your home community, which should be cheaper for rural students. But because of the lack of access, the lack of connection, they can't take advantage of that financial break. A lot of rural communities, not all, but there are large numbers of high numbers of poverty, of low income families. And so they need those financial restraints taken down. They need generous financial aid packages or programs that don't have the added cost of traveling to and from campus, having a dorm, having an apartment, things like that. Another area of the research talks about the faculty, the types of faculty who are quote unquote appropriate for distance learning with rural students. And really what that comes down to, and what I take from it, is the faculty who are really going to be invested and spend that time developing a community, especially if any of your faculty come from small or rural communities. And not just in the United States. If you look at the research, rural populations are a huge conversation piece around the world. And so even if you have a faculty member who's not from the United States originally, they would still be great to lead some sections or some courses on with rural learners because they can speak to it from their experiences. That's what's really meant by appropriate. And then finally, rural students often feel isolated. This makes sense with everything we've talked about, right? Is because of the online learning experience or lack of experience, it feels very isolating. You're just at a computer by yourself, you're posting discussion boards, but they don't have that community. And so I encourage all of you to think about ways we can build that community and we can explore opportunities for more community for our rural students. All right, so questions there about challenges and needs. And now we're going to go into some recommendations, ways to move forward. All right, fantastic. Okay, so now here's where I really want to hear from all of you is what can we do? What should we be doing? First and foremost, we've got to become student ready. And we as institutions, as organizations, as whether you're a faculty member, an administrator, you know, a little bit of one, a little bit of the other, we've got to become student ready. And what I mean by that is we have to understand that we need to shift our perspectives and expectations of students. Personally, I don't think there are many students who aren't college ready. We talk about a college ready student. Students are ready for college. Colleges aren't ready for students because we expect every student to be a middle class, traditional age, 18 to 24, attending a 4-year on-campus experience as an undergraduate. We don't think about 2 years degrees. We don't think about students taking a gap year. We don't think about non-traditional. We don't think about first generation Americans. Everything is based very much on that Harvard model, and it's still based on that. We need to think about student ready. How do we change our campuses to put students at the center? And this means creating environments that support and enable all students to be successful. A lot of times that means changing policies and procedures. So one of the other things you'll see on here is examining policies, processes, and practices to reduce the barriers to student success. And I'll talk about some suggestions here in a minute, but really a lot of it comes from talking to your students, understanding the experience, and recognizing that students, the younger population, especially Gen Z and millennials, they expect and learn very, very different from older populations, previous generations. We need to be responsive to them and not just set up everything as, here's your Canvas page, here are the 5 modules you'll go through in the semester, here's when you do your discussion postings, here's how you do your group work. It needs to be much more engaging and interactive and focused around building that community for our populations of students. We need to be changing things, even if it's incrementally, to be more encompassing and inclusive of all of our populations of students. So what does that mean? Eliminating institutional barriers to enrollment, performance, and successful outcomes. Now, when I think about institutional barriers, that's anything the institution puts into place, okay? We can't really help the geography. College was founded where it was founded, but is there an application fee? Is there a separate application for financial aid or for scholarships that students may not know about? Are there unnecessary fees for online learning courses? Like, am I paying an activity fee if I'm only enrolled online? What are the things that reduce performance? How am I able to create pathways to complete my degree as quickly as possible? Do I have opportunities for transfer if this isn't matching for me? We just need to be thinking about all of the things that students need to have at their fingertips and kind of have accessible and begin working towards developing those types of policies and procedures. That's what student ready means. Removing college and academic jargon that can be confusing at best and harmful at worst. Now, as a first generation student, this is something that I harp on with my clients and anyone I'm working with constantly. We who are in the field of higher education, we understand the acronyms, the abbreviations, FAFSA, ACT, GPA, NCES, IPED. We understand all of those. But first gen students, rural students, students who don't have experience with higher education, they don't know what that jargon means. And a lot of times their parents or their support networks don't know what it means either. So I'm really encouraging all of you to go through your marketing materials, your course catalogs, your enrollment policies. Remove the jargon that may not make sense. One of the things, I remember this from my experience, and I know it's still happening today, is it took me about 3 semesters to realize that credit hour, course credit, and credit were the same thing. Three different ways to describe the same thing. Took me 3 semesters to figure that out, and it was incredibly embarrassing. I also had no idea that most internships were unpaid and that you had to enroll in them. And so that was a big shock for me junior year going into senior year. A lot of students don't understand a lot of the jargon, or why I go to a registrar to register, but I go to a bursar to pay my bill. Those terms that don't exist outside of higher education, right? We've got to go through all these things that we all take for granted and we just know what they are, and step back and say, okay, if I'm someone who's reading this for the first time, a parent, a student, whatever it might be, am I going to get turned off by the language? Is this language going to be so unfamiliar to me that I'm not even going to want to try? Because honestly, that is what happens quite a bit. This is an area, if we're being truly student ready, we have control over this. We can't change federal policy, but we can change wording and verbiage on our college's websites, on our materials and our marketing.
Absolutely. And we have some really nice conversation in chat.
Great.
From Carol, talking about some issues around academic success and students having a clear understanding of what they're supposed to get from the college degree.
Mm-hmm.
And then Nani's adding a library perspective. So very good conversations.
No, that's wonderful. I appreciate both of those. And that's exactly it. I mean, what does student success mean to our presidents, to our boards? It means they're graduating and our numbers look really good for the rankings. Student success might also mean that a student enrolls in a 2-year degree, gets all of the skills, knowledge, and resources they need in 3 classes, and moves right along to their career. That's successful. Now, the college is going to miss that enrollment and they're going to miss that tuition, but that student has been successful. Or if a student, transfers 3 or 4 times, that doesn't seem successful to an outsider, but if the student ends up in the position with the degree they want, that's success. So yeah, what is student success? We need to really investigate that phrase. But these norms, values, traditions, and the status quo, I'm sure many of you who are working in distance learning have gotten the pushback from your senior leaders about online learning, the effectiveness, the research on the pedagogy, on the whether degree programs be fully online or not. I'm sure you've all had that barrier many, many times in your career, but it's time for us to really be pushing back on those and really question the status quo. We've always done online learning to replicate the seat-based learning, right? We're trying to mirror that. But do we really need to? Do we need to approach it differently now that we have this opportunity and now that we know learners respond differently to different types of teaching? That's what I mean by questioning norms and values is, can your online degrees, can your courses be tweaked or revised so that they're better serving your rural students? And then going along with that is being comfortable with discomfort. And that's hard for a lot of people. A lot of people like the status quo. They don't like to make waves. They like everything to stay calm, but we have to become comfortable with discomfort. And that means having uncomfortable conversations with our senior leaders and with our students. It's important that we're actually pushing back and truly advocating for our students. One of the things that student ready means is that we're putting students first, which means it's before our own comfort, before our own policies or our own preferences. You may really be excited that you're opening a new center on campus for this, focus of this area, but could that money be better spent somewhere else? Or could it be funneled into, more fair, more equitable ways to distribute textbooks or computers, laptops, something like that. So again, just questioning our normal ways of decision-making. All right. So we're going to wrap up, and we're a little early, which is great because it gives us plenty of time to talk. But I want to wrap up with some next steps on becoming a student-ready leader. First and foremost, talk to your students. It's always surprising to me when I do presentations and workshops and working with clients, when I say talk to your students, how often I get blank stares of, oh, we didn't think about doing that. Every campus does the climate surveys. They do surveys of students around involvement, belonging, and things like that. But are we really talking to our students? Are we actually asking them for their feedback and their advice? Your students will tell you what they need. They just need to be given the platform to do so. And it can't be on a survey that they do once a semester, once a year, or at the end of the semester assessments for the courses. We as practitioners need to make intentional efforts to research and understand our own student populations, because you may be very surprised at the challenges or at the opportunities that they present to you. They may say, hey, all you have to do is make this little tweak and we'd be great. Or, hey, can we talk about the length of this program that probably could be done in 3 years versus 4 years? Talk to your students because they will tell you what they need. it's better than just going based on assumptions. Again, one of the things I've been fortunate with my podcast is to hear directly from students in a very unfiltered environment, their true experience and their true lived experiences in college, where they say people don't talk about rural students, or they don't support us, or they don't even track us in data. Students will tell you what they need and how they feel othered on campus if you're just talking to them. But please talk to your students, not just through surveys, by doing focus groups, by doing individual outreach, even anecdotal information, just tracking it on Post-it notes or on a blank Word document of just common themes, common refrains you're hearing from students that could inform when you're doing long-term strategy, or when you're looking at revising an office to do new hires or shuffling the structure. But talking to your students is incredibly important. We started this out at the beginning, but defining rural for your institution is critical. Just like having a definition for first generation students is so critical, another definition that's very hard to pin down, creating a definition for rural for your university, for your institution is so important, so you know who you're targeting, who you're recruiting, who you're trying to support. Rural may be very different for an institution, a community college located in a very geographically remote space, versus a four-year institution, like again here in St. Louis, that reaches out into rural spaces but doesn't often pull a lot in. Defining rural for your institution is going to be important, because that's how you're going to track the students. That's how you're going to be able to pull data and reports for them. That's how you're going to be able to see their success. But if you don't have a way to flag and say, okay, this is the success rate of our rural students, you can't actually see if you're truly being successful. Now, this is a bigger step, right? Because to create a definition, to get everyone to adopt it, you're bringing in institutional research, you're bringing in probably faculty senate, you're probably bringing in senior leaders in the chancellor's office, or I'm sorry, on provost side. This could be a little bit challenging, but it's really, really important long-term, because otherwise you just don't know who you're serving. We talked about this around the jargon, but reviewing policies and procedures with a student-centered eye for the inequitable experiences. So again, think of it from a student, read through something, and if anything causes you pause, that might be a good reason to circle it or highlight, say, we need to revisit this. If you're reading through it and it says, students who have completed less than 30 hours register 2 days later, and students who have completed more than 30 hours. Well, is that arbitrary? Is that for a reason? Is that fair? Is that equitable? Can we re-examine that policy to create it more fair? I'm not saying it is or isn't, but those are the types of things that come up as you're reading through. You think about, hey, this might disadvantage our other students, or this might actually hurt some of our populations. But reviewing and weeding it out. And again, one of the best things you can do, honestly, and I've done this with students, is give the students the websites, the materials, the handbooks to review, and have them make changes and ask questions, because you'd be shocked by what students are and aren't familiar with around our policies and procedures. Explore ways to minimize the financial stress. I worked in financial aid for a very long time, so this is something that I'm very passionate about. We have open educational resources. We have we can eliminate fees. We can create more efficient pathways for learning. We have ways within our purview to reduce the financial barriers. Not every student coming from a rural or remote area is very affluent. Not everyone is in poverty. There's, again, just like everything else, a wide spectrum of people coming from rural populations, from rural spaces, but eliminating the financial barriers is a great way to increase the likelihood of enrollment. Can we drop fees? Can we reduce the number of years students have to live on campus? Is there a way to increase financial aid through scholarships with our development office? All of these things are really important, and it's really incumbent on us to push these conversations along on our campuses. All right, finally, and I apologize, it came up in the wrong order. I would love to see everyone advocating at state level for broadband expansion. This is something in some of my other work I'm trying to work on, but we, especially if you're working at a college or university, really working with your advocacy office and moving for broadband expansion. There are things happening at the state and at the federal level, but they are taking a really long time. We need our country to be broadband accessible, coast to coast, north to south, and it's something that is dragging, and we really need the push, especially with larger universities who can really make that public push. Developing pathways to on-campus degrees if a student decides they want to transfer to campus, making that as seamless as possible. Similar with transferability, I know you all already do a lot of work around articulation agreements, things like that, but ensuring transferability for online degree programs, especially whether it's to the same institution or another one, is critical. One of the things that a lot of people underestimate or underutilize is working with local chambers of commerces. Now, community colleges do this great, but for 4 years, we have a hard time remembering that chambers of commerce, workforce agencies, community colleges, they're the ones who know what are happening in the community. So that's how you can develop more workforce focused, more practical degrees rather than just another English degree, another biology degree, all of which are great, but a lot of rural communities, they need manufacturing degrees. They need IT degrees. They need things like running lines, whether it's broadband, fiber optic cable in the ground or online. They need those types of degrees, and you don't know what your students, what the community's workforce needs are unless you're going out and investigating and doing the work. And then finally, identify and foster relationships in the rural communities. This is how you're going to increase trust and a sense of community with the students and the communities themselves. It's actually intentionally going out and recruiting and saying we're here to be a part of the community, and not just saying we're recruiting because we're trying to hit our enrollment numbers, but actually going out and trying to understand and trying to create more custom programs or more opportunities for input from these areas as well, so that they feel that they are part of this. Otherwise, we're just throwing words at them, and they don't feel like there's a sense of belonging or a hook for them. So really getting involved in the communities is incredibly important as well. So that is actually the end of it for me. I apologize. I know I was talking a whole lot, but I would love to take questions, have some conversation in our last few minutes. I'll leave this up on the screen because this has my contact information as well as my social media handles. Please reach out to me. This is the work I love doing. So if your institution, your college, university is interested in talking with me more, bringing me in for workshops, trainings, doing some policy procedure reviews and jargon audits, happy to talk with you about those as well. But here's my contact information, and love to hear if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Matt. And for the last couple of minutes, some fun conversation ensued, and there was a challenge accepted. So, Nan, could I possibly put you on the spot and invite you to talk real quick about that challenge? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Nan Carmack here. I'm the Director of Library Development and Networking at the Library of Virginia, which is the state library here in Virginia. And we spend a lot of time with forecasting the future, trying to be strategic in where we're headed. And our rural communities are seeing a lot of rural flight. And with that, a diminishment of talent. And so, as I cast about looking for touch points, I'm not sure how I became aware of this webinar, but I thought, you know what, there's a touch point. I need to be learning more about this environment. And you guys gave me some really great ideas today that I can see if I can get rolling. Wouldn't it be great if rural public libraries were hosting recruitment sessions for online programs throughout the state? And then building cohorts. It doesn't matter what program they're in, but having social and support groups for online students in their communities to support each other academically as well as socially. And library staff tend to be college graduates, and excuse me, certainly the library leadership are all graduates, have graduate degrees. It's already an instant opportunity for building some of what you suggested, Matt. So I'm really excited about that.
No, thank you, Nan. That's awesome. You're right. And you have a college educated group of individuals right there, ready and probably waiting and excited to serve. And that's actually true, because when I was working with College Advising Corps, our high school advisors, they were situated in the schools, in the actual high schools. But on evenings, weekends, outside of school hours, they would often meet at libraries, because that was a kind of neutral meeting place for students and for families. They had broadband, all that stuff. So rural community libraries have been a huge source of support for not only college advisors, but for other people who are doing that college access work. So Nan, I love you talking about that.
Yeah. And the other piece of that I see is people coming out of high school trying to go into the workplace, and when they find that there just aren't jobs available to them, they might be coming back as an older student and not feeling like they can rely on their parents so much as a traditionally aged student might. So, here's already established, in place institution whose goal is to serve, right?
That's the best way to describe it. That's exactly what
Yeah.
it is. And again, the
Yeah.
other great thing is that librarians, because they've been to college, they just informally can give their advice and their recommendations. You know, I went to Mizzou, I went to Arkansas, like we can share. And so even that informal guidance is critically important, just to have as many of those, again, mentors, trailblazers as possible. Completely agree. Thank you so much, Nan. Any other questions, comments, things that have come up, or anything you'd like me to go over a little bit more in depth? Oh, and really quick, I will say I just dropped in the chat another thing that I'm part of, along with Education Design Lab and Berea College, is the Rural Education Community of Practice. This is a network of several hundred practitioners in colleges, universities, high schools, workforce, kind of anyone touching rural work in any way. We've invited to be a part of this community of practice that we launched last summer. So I encourage you to follow us on Twitter. We're going to be becoming more active, and it's going to be everything focused on rural, post-secondary, from the high school side to the workforce and everything in between. So if you're interested in this work, continue to follow that. Any other questions or comments or things we want to dive into before we wrap up today?
Thank you so much, Matt. I mean, so many things came to mind as I heard you sharing and making recommendations. But one of the things you recommended was to, could we possibly go back to the slide with
Sure.
the workforce reference? I've started seeing initiatives, particularly in California, where free college degrees are being offered in a system where essentially the local businesses invest resources. They fund the education of disenfranchised populations in that local area. And then they provide jobs to the graduates of that program. So what a neat circle of life, you know.
It's incredible.
We are the employers, and we are talking to a local university about the jobs of the future that we need to create to take our industry forward in a sustainable fashion. So then institutions design degrees around those particular competencies, educate these people for free, and then turn around and hire them into those same businesses that produce that. So
it's a brilliant cycle, but it's also so obvious. Like, it's so simple and obvious that it's insane that this is just becoming a thing. Like, that's why I love community colleges. I mean, they're the ones who are doing the work of serving rural populations around the country. They're doing the heavy lifting, but they're also the ones who, like you just said, are responding to the workforce needs. If there's a significant gap in training IT techs or people who are good at cybersecurity, community colleges will respond and create a certificate, an associate's degree. They will work with employers to pay for practicum, to pay for internship, to pay for employment while going to school. They'll work with creating jobs afterwards. The community colleges will get chambers of commerce on board, or the state workforce to create transfer pathways. So, like, the community colleges drive all of that change, but for some reason our 4 years are really slow to change and adapt to the workforce. And in rural spaces, a lot of times that drives it. Rural communities often, again, broad strokes, are often looking at more practical degrees. Teaching, engineering, business, agriculture, things like that are going to serve their community. And we have universities who are creating new micromasters for, you know, English language learning, or, you know, for other things that don't really relate to the practical degrees that our schools need. We need degrees and programs that are going to respond to the workforce needs. That's how we're going to get students enrolled.
Absolutely. Love it, love it, love it. And then, if I may indulge, anyone, please feel free to come in. I don't want to monopolize the floor here, but one thing I would love to ask, Matt, if you're willing to circle back around and add a couple more thoughts to. Early on, you were talking about dual enrollment and the importance of that. Would you be willing to add a couple more thoughts to that conversation?
Absolutely. Dual enrollment. This was something when I started doing work with rural populations, I was shocked at the prevalence and success of dual enrollment. So because again, community colleges are doing a lot of the lifting when it comes to serving rural populations, they're most likely to be co-located in these rural spaces. And so you've got these amazing dual degree programs that students as early as junior year can be taking classes on a college, community college campus, or online through a community college and graduate with their high school diploma and a certificate, an associate sometimes, or at least pretty far along towards an associate's. At the same time, their peers are graduating from high school. Dual degrees are so awesome for two reasons. One, they get you your education quick. Often it's free or for very low cost. And for our rural students, that's great. But it's also expediting your career where you get out of college and you're ready to start working in a good career, or I'm sorry, you get out of high school, you're starting ready to work, or you complete your 2-year degree at the community college and then you're ready to transfer earlier and younger than some of your peers. And so dual enrollment is really, really great because it works for the students, but it also responds to their needs. Geographically close, financially efficient. It also there's built-in trust. I talked about at the end, identifying and foster relationships in rural communities. These community colleges already have those relationships. They're close to the high schools. The high schools know them, the parents, the communities know them, and so they're trusted as a source of post-secondary education. It gets harder for rural populations when they go farther away to 4-year schools, to private schools, where we run into this challenge of resentment of going away, to leaving your community. We talk about the rural brain drain, which we didn't talk about today, is a big piece of that. But dual enrollment allows the students to get college experience, to earn their credits, save money, but also still be in their community. So dual degrees, and again, we could have another conversation on this. Dual degrees is another great way to explore serving your rural students. And it doesn't just have to be the normal dual degree we've seen, time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate you. Any final thoughts? We seem to have generated some very nice conversations, some friendships and desire to keep in touch. So speaking about this desire to keep in touch, Matt, how can we learn more about the rural experience? I know that you produce a podcast you mentioned at the beginning. Would you be so kind to tell us a few words about your podcast and
Absolutely.
what you love about it so far?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going into our 3rd season of the podcast. It's called the Rural College Student Experience. Every episode, I'm joined by a co-host, not just a guest, but a co-host who is a current rural student who's in college or graduate school. And I interview them and find out about their challenges, their experiences, their needs, their frustration. And again, it's a very candid conversation between me and the student. And then each episode, my co-host and I are joined by a guest who's a researcher, a faculty member, someone's working in the rural space or doing research on rural, where the student and I, mostly the student, then is interviewing the guest to push back or ask questions or to poke holes. It has been endlessly educational for me. I encourage others to listen to it, again, not just because it's my podcast, but because you really truly get unfiltered points of view from students. And I've also tried to hit on different populations, students of color, students of multiple identities, queer students, students attending elite institutions, Native American students. So I try to touch on lots of different populations because, again, rural is not a monolith, and we want to try to avoid thinking about that. And then I also encourage, just in terms of periodicals, the Hechinger Report, Hechinger. Hechinger Report covers rural, high school, and college extremely well. I encourage that. I include the rural community practice. If you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I try to share as many rural-related articles as well. But those are the best ways to follow things.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. And I just put a link to your podcast as well as
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Or I'm just making sure I'm spelling it correctly because I'm kind of prone to creating alternate spellings. So hopefully I got that right. Thank you so much, Matt. This has been such a treat, and I'm so excited that you were kind enough to share your expertise with us today. I hope, while this is your first, I hope this is not your last time to speak for the USDLA. Please keep in touch. Many thanks, everyone. Many thanks, Valerie. And if you would like to continue the conversation about leadership, Please join us again next Friday, January 20th, when Dr. Lisa Clark from Blackboard Learn Ultra is going to talk about her research, and she's going to paint a picture about how leaders may want to approach decision-making in faculty training for online teaching and learning. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely weekend. Matt, once again, thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we can probably